These two are one of the best lineups in the sport. Whilst both drivers have been having issues with their car, they have both battled it differently. The points say that Russell is on top, but do the lap times agree? We've gone over every lap of every race and we want to show you what's going on in the data. So let's get into it. So first, Bahrain, and to give you some context, Mercedes were the third fastest car, with Red Bull and Ferrari being away in front. Mercedes were apparently running the cars over-winged, meaning more downforce and so drag than they actually wanted, and that was supposedly down to a lack of parts. But both cars were immediately having bouncing problems, porpoising on the straights, so they had to run the ride height of their car a bit higher, which according to Toto cost them about half a second per lap, and that's about how far they were off in qualifying pace. But here is how it all shook out in the race. These are the lap times of Lewis and George compared to the pace setters Max and Charles. You can see the Mercedes were around half a second off the pace across the entire Grand Prix, but actually didn't see the same kind of tyre drop off the front two teams did. Just look at the end of each stint here. Now, according to Mercedes, the pace in the simulator is good, but that's still the simulator and doesn't account for the porpoising and therefore the performance loss with the bouncing and the increase in ride height they had to make to fix the problem. But fair play, they actually finished P3 and P4 after some dodgy pace. And yes, it's down to both Red Bull's DNFing, but they did maximise their results in Bahrain. And by all accounts, the pace between Lewis and George was very, very similar. George was less than a couple of seconds behind Lewis for the second half of the race, so he may have even been faster, but we can never know. And so moving on to Saudi, and this was a track that really punished cars with a lack of top-end speed, like the Mercedes. Now, Lewis was eliminated in Q1, whereas George went on to qualify P6. And whilst the pace in general wasn't great, the porpoising and ride height stuff doesn't explain the difference between the drivers. In this case, Lewis explained that the balance was all wrong, with the rear snapping with little warning, whereas the setup changes that Russell made seem to have somewhat worked. And it seems that this might be down to the tyres. And if you haven't got the tyres in the right window, Lewis wouldn't have been able to get that car to go any faster. However, he did say that there was more in the car, but the unpredictability left him without the confidence to push harder. And at a fast circuit with the walls close, you need that confidence. Then, despite the issues in qualifying, Hamilton, once he got past Stroll, Gasly and K-Mag, was right up there with George's pace. So clearly he had a handle of it by then. So the issue seemed to be getting the tyres into the right window, and it was Lewis who wasn't getting them hot enough, which does go away to explaining why the race pace was better than the single lap pace, as the tyres had much more time to get up to temperature. The end result was George finishing P5 and Lewis finishing P10. But really, this result makes the difference look worse than it actually was. The pace difference wasn't huge, and once Hamilton got past Magnussen, the pace gap closed up. With a better qualifying, I really think that Hamilton and Russell would have had a much closer finishing result. Then Australia was better. Mercedes got the setup much better on both cars, with better balance and more performance because of it. So Lewis got P5 and George P6 on the grid. Interestingly, when you look back over their qualifying times throughout all 5 races, there is one thing that stands out. Lewis is pretty much always up on the end of straight speeds, but can't quite carry the speed through the corners that Russell can. It's a relatively small difference, 5 to 6 kilometers an hour here or there, but that does point to a general setup preference between the two drivers. Perhaps Russell likes a little more downforce than Lewis, and this can vary by car or setup. Basically, a good driver just wants their car to be as fast as possible over a lap and a race, and they'll drive it to the absolute limit, no matter how much downforce it has. You might remember when Lewis shared his data against Button when he had loads of downforce and Jensen had less. This was at Spa in 2010. And while the difference in the downforce levels isn't huge, and of course driving the same car we wouldn't expect it to be, it's always interesting to see how each driver sets their car up.